All right, 1 2 1 2.
All I can hear is Wu-Tang Clan. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was like, I'm tempted to start a whole verse of Method Man. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us for an episode of Pop Culture Uncovered here from the historic Sankofa Bookstore, located right across the street from Howard University. Also known as my second favorite place in the world. The other one is the barbershop right next door.
That's right.
We have the unique pleasure of having Mr. David Walker with us. One of the legendary creators, obviously, one of part of the creative team for Black Root, which is the
Bitter Root. Don't get mad at me because you're wrong.
the 2020 Best Continuing Series winner for the Eisner. Also, Ringo Award winner for Mr. Sanford Green. So, first off, Mr. Walker, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to almost the same as being there in person. Not quite, but close.
I appreciate it. Well, this is the second time we've had a chance to interview you. Of course, you obviously know Megan. Megan being our resident David Walker fan. I think she knows your CV better than the rest of us do. This, of course, is my sister, Belle. Very, very excited to talk to you. I mean, I guess first things first, you've explored race in a lot of your work. Mm-hmm. What made you want to approach it again from Bitter Root? Because you had already touched on it really extensively with Nighthawk, and you had touched on some of it with Cyborg and with Power Man and Iron Fist.
Well, it's just more than anything. I mean, it's just I live with it every day, and I feel like, especially when it comes to comics and just pop culture in general, there's just not a lot of stuff that talks to me, that appeals to me. And even though I'm getting older, I still have that, I guess you'd call it like a hunger that I had when I was a kid. And so I put that feeling into the work that I do, because I feel like, again, not much has changed in the 150, 200 years since I was a child. And the hope is that maybe I can reach out to some young people and inspire them, but also just trying to inspire myself. When you do the creative stuff, a lot of times what we do is for ourselves or for the kid inside of us.
That's what's up. Before I kick it to my co-host, I did want to ask this other question. What attracted you to this time period? And the reason why I'm asking that, we had the opportunity to talk to you last year in regards to the Black Panther Party graphic novel we've done. So this is the second really historically heavy book, because I will say, I think you smuggled more Black history into this book than was humanly possible, because we would literally have to have a full-blooded conversation about Black Wall Street. We would have to talk about the race riots of 1919. We'd have to talk about double victory and the World War I, Black veterans returning back from the First World War. And so you packed a lot in. And of course, the Harlem Renaissance right on top of all of that. What made this time period so attractive for this story?
Well, first I'll say, if you think this is packed with historical references, wait till you see the new thing that I'm working on. That's going to change everything. But in terms of Bitter Root, in terms of Bitter Root, it really, and the setting, that time period, the Harlem Renaissance, 1920s, I just think more than anything, it's a very interesting time, because at the time they weren't calling it the Harlem Renaissance, they were calling it the New Negro Movement. Right. And so what you had happening in New York was again this explosion of art and creative expression that really would come to define not just the 20th century in America, but beyond, right? Like that just the same way hip hop has influenced the world, for the last 30, 40 years, what was going on during the New Negro Movement was very similar. But at the same time, the rest of this country was as backwards as it's always been, right? We're talking not even 50 years after the Civil War, Reconstruction had failed, Jim Crow, the racism and the white supremacy that has always shaped this country really became a driving force. And I think that conflict, that disparity of what was going on in New York and in and around Harlem versus, say, what was going on in other parts of the, and it was going on in Harlem and New York too, that racism. But you know, 1921, you have the Tulsa Race Massacre. 1919, you had the Red Summer. So there was so much violence and hatred directed towards us, and yet at the same time we're creating art that's going to change the world. And I think that's today, even it's still going on to this day. But I think that's it's just an interesting thing to examine, is how as a people we can create art and express ourselves in a way that lifts the entire humanity up, while our humanity is being denied to us.
I mean, I could talk all day long, but I suppose I should shut up briefly so you can say something, right?
Oh, I was going to say, one of the things I found really interesting was that touch on a woman's place in the books. Because you have both Blink and Wu, who are not down for whatever stereotype you're trying to put them in. And I think it speaks to one of the things about how women in the movement have categorically always kind of been put to the side.
Put to the side. And not just the movement, we're talking, this is global, right? I think about this, I think about the films and TV and pop culture that I was raised on, and it's not exactly, you know, women friendly. It's got its share of sexism and misogyny that, and I feel like if I recognize it now, then it's a real problem. Because I'm very much the clueless man, you know, and I kind of get bored with the same old in terms of just male heroes, male figures, right? And so the challenge to me a lot of the time is to come up with female characters that, not to replace the male characters, just that they can be their own thing. And so to me, again, it was a no-brainer when Sanford, Chuck, and I were putting together Bitter Root, and it was like, well, why would any of us want one of the main characters, the main hero, to be a dude? Because the story is about oppression and coming over oppression, and you know what Black women have dealt with historically, African American women dealt with historically, is on a whole other level than what you know men have dealt with. And that's not saying that we haven't dealt with a lot, because we've dealt with shit. So yeah, that was it. I just find, honestly, I find most men boring, you know. So
I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Meg?
Oh my gosh, thank you again for joining us today. So my question was kind of in that same vein of having the different female characters in the story. And we see generations too.
Yeah.
On how we see kind of the changing of the old guard to the new guard. And we see the juxtaposition of Maeda versus Blink and their ideologies, and how neither one is necessarily wrong, but it's just a different viewpoint. And we also see the appearance of Harriet Tubman as well coming into the, you know, later on in the pieces. So when you were approaching creating the characters, I know that you spoke to not replacing males, but having women there with their own agency, their own motivations. What drew you to these positions? Like the old and the young, and the changing of the guard, because of course that was going on in the society, but why did you write it in this manner?
Well, I'm not going to lie. I don't know. You know, I mean, part of it is I think that there was a dynamic similar to, I saw a similar dynamic just growing up. You know what I'm saying? It was like there was my grandmother and her generation, so all my great aunties who were, you know, 2 generations ahead of me, and then there's my mother and my aunties that generation. They were essentially baby boomers, right? And so I just saw a lot of the generational dynamics growing up, you know, because I grew up in a multi-generational household, so I saw it playing out a lot of the times, and I also, you know, I never put this together, but I realized there was a time with with my cousins, myself and my cousins, where it was like suddenly we became the elders within the family, where it was like, and that happens just like instantly, like you don't have no warning. It's that moment when everybody stops treating you like a kid because a really tough decision has got to be made, and the old folks don't want to make the decisions no more, right? And they're like, nope, you're in charge now. We're just going to sit back and get old gracefully, right? But it's also that moment where the older generation puts faith and trust into the younger generation that says, like, you have to do this now. Now is your time, And so I never really thought about how my own personal experiences related to what myself and the other guys brought to Bitter Root. But as we're talking about it, I can actually see some of that now, right? And it's the interesting thing now is that I'm now getting to that age where me and my cousins and my friends are getting to that point where we're going to have to start handing off some of that leadership roles within our families to the younger people. Like, I ain't ready for it. I'm like, you whippersnappers, you don't know what's good for me.
Yeah, the idea of my children running the world, I'm like,
I would trust your children more than most. Let's put it that way.
We're still working on everybody drying their hands properly when they leave the bathroom.
At least they wash their hands, though. That's the thing.
That's an accomplishment. Every generation, it gets a little bit better. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is that in terms of your co-creators, you worked with Mr. Green before for Power Man and Iron Fist, which I will just say personally was my favorite run of it of all time, including the early stuff. I thought what you guys did was amazing. Should have lasted a couple of years, but I'll take that up with corporate. But so what made you guys come together for this project, and what was it like working with Mr. Brown, who's on his own right an award-winning writer?
Yeah, so when Power Man and Iron Fist got canceled at Marvel, and this is sort of the dynamic of how the industry will work at times, right? So Power Man and Iron Fist was a critically successful book, but sales weren't that good. That's why it got canceled. And when it got canceled, when something like that gets canceled, a lot of times Image Comics will approach a member from a team like that and say, hey, would you like to do something with us? So in this case, they approached Sanford and said, hey, would you like to, do a series, your own, something you've created on your own? And Sanford and Chuck had been working on this project together for a little while, but it really wasn't going anywhere. And it had a couple different names. One was Bitter Root, but then they also, at times, they were calling it the Bloodborns. And it was just like, it was about a family of monster hunters. That was about the extent of it. And so Sanford approached me and said, hey, would you like to work with me and Chuck on this thing? And I was like, yeah, sure. What do you have? And they presented it to me. And then in my usual control freak, domineering, difficult to work with fashion, I said, well, there's a lot of stuff that we need to change if I'm going to work on this, right? But then it slowly started to come together. And we, as a team, we have a really interesting dynamic, and all I can say about, and I say interesting, I'll emphasize it when I say really interesting. It's you don't see the tension that exists between the three of us. It doesn't come out on the page, right? So we're able to work it out behind the scenes. But it's like Megan, I know you were trying to get Chuck to interview Chuck. Chuck ain't ever going to respond to none of your emails because that's how Chuck is, right? Chuck is the quiet, withdrawn one who does not want to be in the public eye, but he does want to be invited, right? So he wants to ignore all your emails, doesn't want to respond, but then gets mad if you don't respond, right? Right. But as a team, so there's just a lot of I can't lie, we fight all the time, and that's the thing that's like, so when we won the Eisner this year, I was kind of like, yo, man, I can't believe they gave it to us again. Like, the way we, but see, to me, the fighting is the way family fights, right? Yeah. And so, not everybody is blessed with a harmonious family, and so if there is a lot of discord amongst the people you love the most, you learn how to deal with it. But with Bitterroot, there's just always been this. Uh, it's to me, it's a lot of fun, except for when it's not fun. If that makes sense, when it's hard work.
Oh, there's hope that you and I might not choke each other over the course of recording.
There
this
really is
podcast.
not.
Oh, you don't think so?
No.
Okay. Well, all right. That's just
There's no Pete here to buffer.
literally just strangled hope right in front of me. But
I'll say this though. See, I live on the West Coast. Sanford and Chuck both live in South Carolina, right down the street from each other. And on any given day, I'll get a call from either one of them, and they'll be like, oh man, it'll be Sanford. It'll be like, man, Chuck ain't answering the phone. And I went over to his house and he wouldn't open the door. And I'm thinking, well, if you came over to my house unannounced, I wouldn't open the door either. But we live right down the street from each other, and more often than not, one is not talking to the other, and then I'm the one who's having to play referee. So in that regard, it is like family. So
you're very much me and my siblings, right? With that,
Lord
yeah.
Jesus. All right. Well, before I can get back to y'all, I did want to ask one follow-up question. The overarching theme of Bitterroot seems to be hope, and I just wanted you to touch upon that because there was a quote that I just have to read for the audience. You gave Blink one of the best lines in the entire book, where she says, "Don't ever talk to me about the way things are unless you're willing to talk to me about how things can be."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was such a powerful line and such a powerful moment for that character, especially since how she ends up by the time we get to the end of Volume 3. She's the leader, but she's a reluctant leader. Like, it's not like she's like, yeah, I'm in charge. It's I hope I'm up to the tasks. But because I feel like that idea of hope ties into how you structured, your villains, which is kind of hard for me to say villains because really outside of Adro, everybody is kind of a victim and trying to navigate their way through hatred. So how did the concept of hope kind of extend across the book?
Now this might sound kind of weird. I put the hope. I wanted us to put the hope in the book because there's I personally have such little hope, right? I'm the super cynical one out of the group, and so I didn't want to make a book that was totally devoid of hope because we don't need that. We can turn on the news and see that at any given moment. You go out in the street and see that at any moment. And I think that speaks to how I was raised. I was raised by my grandparents and my mom, and my grandparents were, my grandmother especially, and her sisters were always the things can get better. Hold out, work, push for it, right? My grandfather was hated everybody, and so I'm kind of more like my grandfather deep down inside, but I still hear my grandmother's voice in my head, and it was difficult because, again, we live in a very difficult time, but I didn't we don't need comics or stories that are devoid of hope, because that's why people turn to literature and film and music. We want to feel something, and as we're moving forward in the next arc of Bitterroot, which takes place in 1964. It's like,
wow.
There ain't no hope in it, right? And that's the struggle that I'm having, and that we're having as a team, is how do we get into how do we go darker than we already went? And I think from a storytelling standpoint, it made sense to give us that sense of hope and that sense of light in those first 3 volumes that are all set in the 20s, and now we're going to jump ahead 40 something years, and it's gone, right? And so I'm taking the story very much from we'll say like Malcolm X in 62, 63, before he went to Mecca, before he, when he was still heavily, involved with the Nation of Islam, and that militancy that he had, which also gave birth to the Black Power movement. which all were coming out of like I feel a great sense of hopelessness. And so trying to figure out how to funnel that into the next arc without it being such a downer that nobody wants to read it, right? Because nobody wants to. I don't want that, and I'm cynical as hell. So if I don't want it, then who does?
Yeah, that makes sense. Megan.
So on the first volume, we do get a plethora of different characters. Who would you say was your standout character? Who was like one that left the biggest impression upon yourself while writing it and as the story, as you're crafting the story?
I think that for me the two are Blink and Sylvester, and because ultimately as a team we took both of those characters much further than we had originally intended. So we had originally intended that it was going to be more of Blink and Cullen rising up to be the leader, and then I was like, I got to the point where I felt like we did that, then it would negate anything that Blink goes through. It would show that she's got to have a man at her side, her cousin, whatever. And again, I've already seen that type of story with Cullen, right? Where you see that in the Star Wars movies, right? Where it's Luke and Princess Leia, right? I didn't want that. And then Sylvester, I knew from the beginning that he couldn't be the villain, right? So Sylvester represents to me that's I guess that tragic anti-hero or that villain, if you want to call them, that's inside of all of us, right? It's like this dude is broken, right? He's as broken as he can get, but by the end we begin to turn him around, and I and we always were debating back and forth how much would he turn around, what would his role become moving forward, and a lot of stuff becomes dictated after that first arc was done because we didn't know how people were going to respond. We didn't know what characters people were really going to like, and suddenly it was like, oh well, they're responding this way to whether it was Blink or Cullen or Berg, but those are the two that, from a storytelling standpoint, kind of surprised me the most.
Bill, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. I just want to comment. I think you could teach a master class on writing about Dr. Sylvester, because I think Bitterroot would come off very differently if it was, black folks are the victim, white folks are, are the aggressor. I think the way you went out of your way to have the Jinnu and the Inzuado and how everybody is capable of falling into hatred, and how you do have Sylvester as he loses his wife to cancer. He loses his children to the Tulsa massacre, finds himself being hopeless, but his act of bravery of driving Adro back through the portal is probably the first major heroic act in the book. So yeah, I mean, I think the book would be very much a one note if you didn't have that kind of complexity to your antagonist.
Thank you, and that was a huge thing for me. And again, it comes back to one of my heroes has always been X, and if you study his life and you study how he was portrayed by the mass media and the news media, like I remember when people were still afraid of him. I'm that old, right? Before Spike's movie came out, people knew who Malcolm X was. Now people who read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then people that were peace, right? And then really began to study and understand him more, and it's like, oh, we see him differently. And in comics, and I'll dispel one of the greatest myths of comics right now. They talk about the X-Men, how Charles Xavier and Magneto are supposed to be modeled after Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and that's total bullshit. There's no truth to that whatsoever, right? But I do kind of like that comparison, and I love in comics and mainstream comics there's few characters that have ever changed and evolved the way Magneto has changed and evolved, and done it in a way that makes sense for the character. They've had other characters change and evolve, but it's usually pretty, just ridiculous. And so I thought about that a lot, and Chuck and I talked about that a lot with Dr. Sylvester. It was always, well, we want him to be as close to our Magneto as we possibly can be. But the thing I always like to point out, when you first meet Magneto in X-Men back in '63 or whenever that first issue came out, that's some nerdy stuff right there. There you go.
Right on my thing.
He's literally the head of an organization called the Brotherhood of Evil.
Yep.
And so he was very one note then too. It wasn't until really the 80s that I would say that dimension started coming out. And for me as a kid reading, I'll get super nerdy. I think it was X-Men 150, where we really begin to see him as like this Holocaust survivor, all that. I must have been in junior high school when I read that, but it was like, yo, wait a minute. This is like, there's more to this dude than we're letting on, right? And that was the thing I liked about Marvel Comics, especially the 70s and 80s. There was right around that same time they did a story about Doctor Doom, where we got to see sort of things from his point of view. And then they also did I'm really nerding out now. There's an issue of Fantastic Four with Dr. Octopus, where Sue Storm is about to give birth, and Octavius is the only one that can deliver the baby, and yeah. So, but I love that. I mean, I think this is really fascinating to me. I love the villains, right? Mm-hmm. And part of the reason I love the villains is and this is an oversimplification of it, but I was raised by the villains, right? I mean, as Black folks in this society, that's what we are. We're already cast in the villainous role, right? And I happen to have people in my family who were involved, for lack of a better term, involved in criminal activity. But I didn't know that when I was a kid. These are just my uncles. These are just cousins who are doing what they do. And so my perception of good and evil isn't quite as clear cut as mass media wants us to think. And so I was always, again, fascinated with the quote unquote bad guys, because it felt like, well, these are my family members, right? And it's more complex than that, but that informs a lot of the storytelling that I do.
And then for me, when looking at Dr. Sylvester, it actually kind of reminds me of Star Sapphire. How the Star Sapphires, their driving emotion is love. But we see how being driven by pure love, and it can turn into obsession. It can turn into, I'm going to protect my love at any cost, and it can turn violent. And, just thinking about, that entire run with like Darkest Night, Brightest Day and stuff like that, and how they weaved in how emotions aren't always as clear cut. Love is great, but it can also lead to not so great outcomes. Yeah. So that's always kind of what I was thinking about when I was looking at Dr. Sylvester, and how in its own twisted way, what he was doing was rooted in love.
Yeah.
And how that can change and be corrupted at every turn. And you wake up and you realize you're the villain in someone else's story. We're always the hero in our own, but we never recognize how we can become the villain in someone else's.
I talk about that all the time with my students in my writing class, and I feel like, I mean, I always tell people, like, I know the people who I'm the villain of their narrative, right? And so if you ever meet somebody who hates me, I can tell you if they've earned that hatred or not, right? Because it's like, and it's not like I intentionally did it, but there's some people out there at the end of the day, the relationship is over, or you're no longer working together, and they just tell that story. And we live in a country a world, for the most part, but really in this society, especially, that has been raised on these ideas of heroes and villains, and it's conditioned each of us to think of ourselves as the hero, and in order to be complete as a hero, you got to have a villain, right? And we're seeing that on a societal level now, because that's what, that's what all the MAGA freaks are all about. They think they're the heroes. They absolutely think they're the heroes, and the rest of us are looking at them like, you got to be crazy, But that's it's once you it's like syphilis, right? They've got a spiritual syphilis that is eating away at their soul, and you have to want to cure that, and they don't want to cure it because they love being infected.
I'm writing that down. Spiritual syphilis. I'm
I
gonna find
was gonna say that's a new term. I will credit you, but I am definitely using.
Yeah.
Now you need some penicillin. You need some spiritual penicillin because you over there trying to infect me. I'm using that.
One of the things to Megan's earlier point is that you are, and to Armand's, that you are a writer, in my opinion, who uses the characters to move forward the plot, as opposed to the other way around. So that is incredibly hard, to make sure that the characters are acting in a way that makes sense, because we see it all the time. You and I have had this discussion about the MCU, where you have whole movies where characters just ignored all their actions in the previous movie because the plot demanded that they behave a certain way.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that a little bit? And then also, for me personally, one of the things that stood out for the books for me is PTSD and grief. Because my mom's a former soldier.
Okay.
So for me, and the maiden mother crone thing that you have, that you didn't plan to do, but you did, I love. For me, one of the bigger arcs of the story is that how do you deal with coming back from a war zone? My mom fought in both Gulf Wars and in Vietnam. And so how do you come back and be here now? Because Cullen and Blink's mom,
Oh yeah, Nora.
Nora, are coming back to a world, and they have to come back after living through hell, or as close to it as you can possibly get. And so for one of those things that really stood out for me in the book is how you touch on that. So what was the thought process behind that? And how do you, for those who are watching who are writers, how do you make sure that your characters are not behaving in a way that's dictated by the plot, but instead the plot, they're reacting in character to what is happening?
Yeah, no, it's hard. It is. One of the things is, and I tell this to my students, the first thing you got to do is you got to finish the first draft or whatever you're working on. But then you can't be scared of the 25th draft, right? You have to get to where it is. I'll give you a great example. But at one point, we were really when Cullen comes back from Barzak, and he's scarred and he's full of this rage. We had talked about at one point having him take a full turn and becoming fully evil. Like we were going to have him become the one of the main villains of the series, and I couldn't quite make it work. And Chuck had written this sequence that was like, in my estimation, was over the top, and took Cullen as evil as you can get. But what the thing was is it felt forced and it didn't feel real, and we hadn't earned it. And I realized that Cullen had been raised by a family with as much love and support as anyone could ever hope. And even though he literally goes to hell and comes back and loses everything, there's so much love in him that at the end of the day, he can't be totally lost, right? I don't want to give up on him. But Chuck and I argued about that quite a bit, because at one point we had made the decision, yes, we're going to turn him evil. And then Chuck wanted to stick with that. And I kept seeing that it wasn't working. And I kept saying, no, just because we made up our minds that we wanted to do this doesn't mean we get to do it. Because if we do it, it's going to ring hollow. It's not going to be sincere. I always come back to there's a scene. There's a movie, L.A. Confidential, with Russell Crowe and Guy Pearce, and there's a moment where Russell Crowe's character becomes the worst person in the world, and movie's old enough I can spoil it, but the one thing he hates is men who physically abuse women, right? Because that's what his father did. And there's a moment when he knocks around Kim Basinger, and it's just a brutal scene. He's in love with her, and then he physically abuses her. And it is the most painful scene to watch, because we don't want him to do this. As an audience, we know what he's about to become, but it's built up to it. It's made this natural progression, and it makes sense and it works. And so I tend to think about that a lot. I think that no world is so interesting that it can carry an entire story if the characters aren't interesting, right? And therein lies some of the problem. I'll probably get in trouble with this, but therein lies the problem with the MCU. Is there comes a point where it's like, yeah, I'm just tired of this. Like if you had told me 20 years ago I'd be tired of this, I might not have believed you, because we might not have been getting, I didn't know we'd get this. And so for me, that idea of character and what character does is so crucial. It's part of the reason it takes me so long to write something. I'm working on something now where I've got to make sure my characters remain true to themselves. I got to make sure they remain true to this world that they exist in. But then more importantly, they also have to remain true to our society as we live in it, because it's set in a reflection of that society.
Well,
I don't know if that answers the question, but
I was gonna say, having been a Cullen fan, you did send him to hell and back, literally.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you didn't have him become the villain, because I would say I was shocked when he doesn't become the villain, and I felt like you did a masterful job setting that up, because one of the things that I enjoyed about this story was the fact that there was no character that was completely beyond redemption.
Yeah.
Sure, people who were so demonically possessed, at that point they didn't even look like human, like they were remotely humans anymore. But for Cullen and for Ford, I guess the thing that stood out for me is, it's that old saying, that old adage, be careful fighting monsters lest you become one yourself. Yep. And I feel like that was really at the heart of the book. And I thought, because look, this is America. People are terrified of black men in anger. The Second Amendment pretty much exists because of the underlying concept of they're terrified of black rage and, they're going to revolt and retribution. So I guess my question is, when you were doing Ford and Cullen, and you're kind of exploring these themes of redemption and anger, and where anger can bend and break us, because Ford starts off the story, he's talking to Johnny Ray, and he's like, yeah, I got nothing for you. And Cullen is like, I don't care if you get killed or not.
Yeah.
And both of them, by the end of the story, end up in a place where they're like, okay, people are people.
Yeah.
And there are good people and there are trifling people.
Well, so it's interesting because Johnny Ray exists because I wanted a white character that I could kill off, right? I was raised on all the books and comics and movies and everything I watched as a kid always had that black character that got killed, right?
Yep.
And
First.
they got killed to propel the story forward, right? And I have this whole theory about that, which is it's because we historically have never been treated as human beings in this country. We've been treated as property. We were 3/5 of a person, all of that. And that ideology seeped into storytelling, okay? And so we became these plot devices. And so I just simply wanted to reverse that, right? And that's where Johnny Ray came from. And then I realized, well, that's lazy storytelling if when he dies, it doesn't have an impact. I want the reader to feel something when this kid gets killed. And the only way that they can feel it is someone in the story is going to have to feel it. And then it was like, well, the person who's going to feel it the most will be Ford. And because Johnny Ray helps Ford to see things differently. And then when you kill him, like we're killing part of Ford. We're killing this new or injuring this new part of him that's come to life. And then in the third arc, we see where that takes him, right? And again, I always come back to, I talk a lot about Malcolm X, and I just remember as a kid reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then studying up on him, and after his pilgrimage to Mecca, how much he changed in his philosophies, right? But he didn't just change in his philosophies on a personal level. He stood in front of the world and said he had changed, right? And to me, that's about as courageous as it gets, right? So I've always held that in my heart. And so when I was thinking about Ford and what he was going to go through in the death of ultimately the death of Johnny Ray, I kept saying he has to come out the other side a different person. Like it doesn't necessarily need to be obvious right away, but it has to be there. And as we were crafting that third arc, suddenly just found these moments where, like with the orphans in that small town, where it's like every single, both Ford and Cullen have an opportunity to become better than who they were when we first met them. They have an opportunity to become not only selfless, but also because that was the thing. Cullen chose to leave. He didn't know if his father was dead for sure or not. So he made a selfish act, right? Mm-hmm. He has to make a selfless act, but then, and it's none of that. As I say this, like I said, this stuff comes out in the 25th draft. I start looking at things like pieces of a puzzle and going, okay, we have to do this, this, and this. And sometimes in the case of Bitterroot, because of the way we produced it, sometimes you make decisions that you go, okay, yeah, this is going a little bit against what we started with, but like, hopefully no one will remember. So you just kind of keep moving.
To that real quick, do you guys have what we in theater call a show Bible?
Somewhere. There is one somewhere. I'm not good with that sort of stuff. And so I just tend to, I tend to go with these gut feelings more than anything else, right? And so, like, I know some of the stuff, if anybody hasn't read the series, like we're just dropping spoilers, but hey, if you haven't read the series, that's your problem, right? It was like when the decision was made to kill Enoch, part of the reason that was made to kill Enoch was because it was like, I felt like Link needed to have unresolved emotional trauma, right? She needed to have more than just her fear of being a leader to get over. She had to get this semblance of hatred to get over, and to understand that in the heat of battle, decisions have to be made, and not everybody's going to, survive. And I would say, of all the family dynamics in Bitterroot, the dynamic between Blink and Enoch most represents the relationship between me and some of my uncles, who I did not, as I got older and began to understand the things that they were doing and how they were affecting the family, created a lot of hostility. And then with one of my uncles, when he passed, like, I hadn't resolved any of that stuff with him, right? He died. I was well into my 30s at that point, and I still had all this bitterness and all this hostility towards him. And it's like, you don't want to live with that. That is the worst thing to live with, because then you got to resolve it on your own.
Yeah.
Meg?
So you've alluded to it earlier in the discussion about how I mentioned in the comments, like, your relationship with Mr. Green and Mr. Brown is like New Edition. Where that's how it resonates for me, because it's like the tension is always there, the battle certainly the egos, the yelling, the screaming,
Oh my
but
God.
at the heart of it, it so comes across. You can tell that first the 5 and then the 6, they're
Yeah.
brothers. That's
Yeah.
the underlying thing. Like, we can talk crap about each other all we want, but no one else can. And then
Don't
when
you say
we come
nothing.
together, we are a unit. We are family.
Don't talk about
So,
Ralph Vaughn. Don't do
yeah.
it.
So listen, I was about to break out If It Isn't Love. Okay, listen, that Any Heartbreak, that Home Again album, both of those albums are seminal to me. But you know, this is for us. This is a fairly unique piece of work because there's not one, there's not two, but there are 3 writers.
Yeah.
So how is your approach when you were writing this piece? Like, what's the process? I guess you could say the project management. Like where's the final stop? Like, who gets to, where the decision making lies? How do you vote for what gets put in and what gets taken out? Can you speak to more of the actual just the writing process itself?
I'm imagine Rick James without the cocaine. And that's me. I'm Rick James without the cocaine. So
I don't know everything that's happening right now, honestly.
no, there's a lot of, it's interesting because I love Sanford and I love his work, and I this is not me throwing him under the bus. Sanford will draw what he wants to draw, right? So we'll come up with the script. Chuck and I will come up with the script and hand it off to Sanford, and then Sanford draws whatever he wants to draw, and then sometimes it's really close to what we've written, and other times he'll venture off and do other things, and then I take what is drawn and then I'll rewrite accordingly to make it work. It's been more so I tend to be, I feel like if all that matters is if the story is good, right? So maybe Rick James isn't the best example. It might be Prince, right? Because when you hear the stories about like how Prince, how he treated both the revolution and then the new power generation, and then all, and he's playing all the instruments and he's doing all the stuff, but then Wendy and Lisa come out and they're like, yeah, he was kind of difficult to work with. It's I know they say that about me, and I'm like, yeah, I don't care, because we just made Purple Rain, or we just made,
Right.
Under Cherry Moon, or Around the World in a Day, right? Not to compare Bitterroot to those albums, but there is a lot of pushing and pulling amongst us, but what it really comes down to is if we push to make this the best book we can possibly make it, we can all have bragging rights. But if I'm just trying to make this the best thing that I can write, or if Chuck's trying to make this the best thing that he can write, or Sanford's trying to make this the best thing he can draw, but we're not thinking about the book itself, the book won't work. And so you have to kind of put things, I'm not going to say you have to learn how to put your ego to the side, because the ego is part of what makes us capable of doing this, right? But it's about knowing how to trust your partners, and then knowing how to, Sanford, he draws, I don't draw, right? I went to art school, so I understand visual composition, but I can't do what he does. And so I will look at what he does, and if there's something that I see that's glaring, I'll say, hey man, this is kind of off. Just like he'll say, hey, this doesn't work from a composition standpoint the way you guys wrote it. But to me, it's like, if the book ain't good, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how good either of us are as individuals. You have to be. And again, so you go back to New Edition, right? And I don't care what anybody says. Ralph Tresvant's solo album was okay, right? I wasn't that big of a fan of Belle Biv DeVoe.
Right.
Bobby Brown, I like some of his solo work. Johnny Gill, forget about it, right? But as a group, they all work together, right? And so the thing is like, yeah, I may own all of their individual albums, but I'm not listening to Belle Biv DeVoe stuff that often on their own, and I'm not listening to Johnny Gill stuff that much on its own, and so that's but again, New Edition, and then Any Heartbreak, and like there was a run of like some really good albums, and so I think about it that way. It's like we can have our own solo careers if we want to, which we do, but Bitter Root is us as a team. At least that's what I say. Now, if you talk to Sanford and Chuck, they'll say something different, and they'll be like, "Oh, well, he's just mean."
I mean, I'm feeling some kind of way seeing how you just stomped on my childhood. I'm like, look, I like the, you need a man with sensitivity. I thought it wasn't that bad.
That is a dope song. You need a man with sensitivity. But when you think about it, that's about the only track we remember off that album.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's the point I was going to make. That was what exactly I was going to say. After Sensitivity, what are you going to say? Sensitivity remix? No.
Yeah. He had that other song called, it was Rated R or something like that. This rhythm is rated R. And it was like, nah, bro, that's kind of...
No, that's corny. That's corny. Sorry.
I will close out the whole any part of this conversation by saying at least Ralph Tresvant stuff ages better than BBD. Because when you listen to some of the lyrics, it's like, that's sounding a little statutory.
I mean, so did some of New Edition stuff. I'm not gonna lie. Listen, when he was talking about, what do you say? It was a young girl heartbreak, and she got it going.
Oh yeah.
Get on, Ron. Get on, Ron. Listen.
You just gonna move on.
Yeah.
Territory that is not.
So one of the things we were talking about earlier was each of the characters. Where do you see volume? We now know that Volume 4 is going to be set in the 60s.
Yeah.
I think personally, it's very frustrating for me to keep seeing that we have to keep repeating these same cycles. We are back as a country, as a people, in some ways worse off than we were during the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Some ways better, but it's incredibly frustrating that we have parents who are old enough to have been at those marches, who are now out there having to do it all over again. And humanity is cyclical, unfortunately. If we don't learn from our mistakes, we are doomed to keep repeating them. So how do you address that? I know you're talking about how you don't want to be hopeless in the book.
I'll be honest. I'm still figuring that out. I'm still figuring that out because one of the reasons, like 64, 63, 64, 65, those 3 years in particular were so crucial, and so many horrific things happened. So many hopeful things happened too. 63 is the March on Washington, right? But then also in that time frame, you get the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. You get the killings of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, which just happened to be 3 civil rights workers whose names we know, but there's all the others who died, right?
Yeah.
There's Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So again, there's triumph and there's tragedy, and I feel like I'm leaning more towards let's start really. Let's take the kid gloves off with this series, right? Like I felt like we've taken it easy on the reader at this point, right? And part of it is we've given them hope. What happens if we take 3 steps back from that hope and then look at where society is? Because when you get to the 60s, we have this, we've been conditioned to think about this with almost a sense of nostalgia in terms of, again, all the advances that were made but it's like, how can you say we had advances, which we did? So I'm not dismissing that, but because just like a week or two ago was the anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church.
Yeah.
Like that ain't moving forward, right? That's to me, that in a lot of ways represents the depths to which this country sank, and we have yet to really come out of that. Yeah, there's legislation that was passed, but then there's been legislation that's been reversed, right? And I don't think I keep coming back to, this is what keeps me up at night, is like, are people really going to see the bitter side, the bitter root? Are they going to see the cynical side of what we as a team can come up with? And again, Sanford and Chuck are well, Chuck is dark. He's more cynical than I am, I think, at times. I don't want to create something that is so, I don't want us as a team to create something that is so nihilistic and so negative that it doesn't have any sense of hope. So that there is going to be hope in it, but right now I don't feel it in myself, and so I've got to figure out a way to make sure that I don't bring that hopelessness to this world. But it also has to be there has to be a darkness in that world. I really do. I think that because and I also think that the 60s is a great era to set it in, because that's just as the 20s and the Renaissance were crucial time. There was a lot of stuff that happened in the 60s that was crucial, and I think within the world that we've set, the big question is going to be, what is the world as a whole going to look like? And what I can tell you is that if the first 3 volumes of Bitterroot looked like had a passing resemblance to the real world, at this point, the way it's moving, the 60s are going to look a lot less like what the 60s look like in reality.
No, that's fair. I mean, look, if you tried to craft an overly hopeful tale, I would accuse you of being Pollyanna-ish. So, look, it's a challenge. I went to Howard Law, and I've, looked at all the arguments of how we did Brown versus the Board of Education. And even for me, I was sitting, I'm like, this is like living through Reconstruction falling apart all over again. So I think if you craft the story in any way that doesn't touch upon that the necessity for hope when hope seems to be in short supply, I think it starts to degrade the story. I know we're running short on time, and you've been incredibly gracious. I have to ask the following. So you're getting a movie.
Yeah.
So you're working with Legendary Pictures, and with Ryan Coogler. For those who are not initiated, Ryan Coogler is the wonderful director who's responsible for providing us with Black Panther and now Creed, yep, and Wakanda Forever. With something that is this complex and this layered, knowing that you are dealing with the American movie industry, where they tend to, I don't want to be unkind, they tend to dumb down the material to the lowest common denominator for the people who are still reading on a middle school level. How do you maintain the integrity of this project and move into that medium? Well,
part of it is I have to step aside and go, okay, I'm going to have faith that Coogler and Regina King and all the other people are going to make sure something happens, that they don't go the wrong direction. And once in a while I'll chime in, but I'm off over here writing my comics and my graphic novels. And what I can say is that there's been enough conversations that that they're sort of on the same page, right? They're really, they want to do something. They recognize what we've done here, and they want to remain as faithful to that as possible. And I think that there's been all kinds of delays in it's still moving forward. So, but the pandemic hit. That slowed everything down, and then even more recently, the horrific tragedy within Regina King's family slowed things down, and there was a point where all of us were just sort of sitting back, going, "Well, is she still going to stay on board? What does she want to do?" And honoring her and her grief, and not going, "Hey, what do you want to do?" And so I think that I remain optimistic. But I also have this, I always go back to Stephen King, who has his philosophy is, when people ask him, well, how do you feel about all the terrible movies that they've made out of your books? And he's like, yeah, my books are my books. You know, they're on the shelf back here. I don't have any control over the movies. So I feel like I don't have, I have control over the comics. Chuck Sanford and we make the best comics we can make. If the film, and I shouldn't say if, when they make the film, because I want to remain optimistic that they'll make the film. When they make the film, I have the supreme confidence in the team that's been assembled at this point. You know, I mean, I loved Creed. I loved Black Panther. I loved One Night in Miami. I couldn't ask for a better group of people to be working with at this point. Now, if somehow they mess it up and they make a bad movie, hey, that's on them. You know?
Bella, I'm going to go to you. I'm just going to say, seeing how you're doing the movie and there's a big, bald-headed, broad-shouldered brother who's abnormally verbose, I'm just saying, I'm not opposed to making an appearance, if it helps the project. No, go ahead.
All I was going to say, big nerd. Okay. All I was going to say is, question, was doing a television series an option, like a limited series? Because the depth of the books makes me actually feel like it would be better as a limited series instead of a film. I think that you can explore the characters more fully, and then you can do arcs. But was that not an option, or is that something you guys chose not to do?
No, it was. There was another company that had come at us, and we were really close to signing a deal with them, and that was going to be for TV.
Right.
And then Legendary came at us really last minute, and they said, we're interested in doing it as a film. To which myself and everybody on the team and our lawyer, everybody said, hey, if you want to make an offer, it's got to be really aggressive. And here are the points that this other company is not meeting us on, because we were fighting and negotiating a couple of key deals, right? Key parts of the deal. And Legendary came through. And the thing was but they wanted to make a movie. Now, within their rights that they procured, they do have the rights to do spin-offs in terms of film and TV and animation, which was more than the other company was asking for. And so it just made more sense. Part of me feels like, yeah, okay, it needs to, I felt in the beginning like it needed to be a series, my own self, something you might see on Netflix or HBO Max. But two things have happened since then. One is we kind of figured out how to make it work as a film. So there was that. But then the other thing is we sort of see the whole streaming wars that's going on now with HBO Max falling apart and Netflix restructuring and all that sort of stuff. And so that landscape has changed dramatically in just the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So, we'll see what happens. But it's so much of that is out of my control that all I can do is try not to get too frustrated about it.
Well, Legendary is very good about sneak attack series.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is they slowly built up the MonsterVerse.
Yeah.
Over the course of 10 years, and we didn't notice until Godzilla vs. Kong came out, and it was like, oh well, wait, there was 3 previous movies that built to that, and the same thing with the terrifying movies.
The Conjurings?
Yes, where you realize all of a sudden you're watching a series of really good but genuinely terrifying films. So I think that honestly they're more trustworthy. I would trust them more than Warner's right now.
Man, we not touching. Look, I could do a whole show on Warner Bros. You know what's bad?
You don't want to get me started.
It's Discovery Warner.
Oh, I'm not a Discovery. Yeah. They can discover. I ain't gonna say they can discover
some words not for people that are under a certain age. Yes.
Megan, do you have any closing questions you wanted to ask before we start to wrap up?
So at the risk of sounding like one of those, commoner, whatever you want to call it, I often do this, like many other nerds do. But do you envision any certain actors or actresses to play in the role? Obviously, we know that people's schedules don't always permit for it and things like that. But and you don't write in the intention of thinking, I'm going to make this into a movie or this is going to be a TV show. But I always like to dream because I always say, Michael Clark Duncan, may he rest in peace.
Yeah.
He was always going to call somebody a poozer. So I was just, that was always in my mind. He was going to call somebody that. But we're not going to get that. And I've always imagined like Brittany Murphy would have been the perfect Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
So do you have any actors or actresses that in your own head canon and your head casting that you would like to see in any of the roles?
They're all dead. So that's the thing, right? They're all from generations past. So Blink, to me, there's an actress back in the 30s and 40s. Her name was Nina Mae McKinney. Some people think her name was Nina, but it was Nina Mae McKinney. That's Blink in my mind, right? Berg is, I think the closest to Berg right now is maybe like, I could see Brian Tyree Henry being Berg, right? But I could also see someone like Yaphet Kotto, at his
I can see that.
70s being Berg. So there's to me, it's easier to engage in that sort of fan casting of generations past, because also there's so many brilliant actors and actresses that we don't really necessarily see how brilliant they were, because the roles that they were stuck in. The one person I would love to see cast, and everyone laughs when I say this, it's the actress I'd like to see play Ma Etta. There's two. One's dead. That's Zara Cully, who was Mother Jefferson on the Jeffersons, right? But the actress I really want to see play Ma Etta is Janelle Monáe, and I want to see Janelle Monáe in old age makeup playing Ma Etta.
Okay, I can see that.
I mean, y'all gonna have me thinking about that for the rest of the night. Like every time I pick up the book, I'm gonna be like, that.
I always do that. My brain always.
Well, that's because you're smarter than me.
Well, also because I'm a director.
Oh, well, yeah.
Paul Robeson as
That's
either.
I'm thinking of it. I'm like, he would be great in any part. But yeah.
Well, I would love to keep you for another 12 and a half hours, but seeing how you were kind enough to already stick over for an extra 38 minutes, I guess I'll make my closing question this. Is there any conceivable chance that Marvel's going to bring you back to do Nighthawk again? Because I swear, so help me.
Oh my God! Don't say that because I'm going to rage at.
Well, okay.
Oh my God! You don't understand how much I've been wanting Nighthawk. Listen, Linda. Don't do this to me because I'm going to be in my feels all over again. My God, I love that book. My God, I love that book. Shades of Icon and Rocket, but I love that book. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't see it happening. I honestly don't see it happening. I don't think that, honestly, the vast majority of editorial who was at Marvel when that series came out, they're all gone anyway. And I don't know, and Megan, I don't want to break your heart. I don't know if I'd have interest in going back there. I'm working on a new project right now that it is like, my goal is to have a book that will be banned before it's even come out, right? And so I'm working on a book right now. When we're done with this podcast, I'm gonna go back to writing it, and it's something nobody's gonna be expecting from me, and it's gonna be like insane, and it's gonna be like Bitterroot turned up to 11, So, and I'm doing it with Marcus Kwame Anderson, who's the artist on the Black Panther Party. So it's not going to be no joke.
Nice.
Well, I'll just say, if you could come up with anything harder than a black vigilante who's going around beating up crooked police officers,
I got it. It's happening. It's happening.
Okay, please, the instant you get to the point where you're going to drop promotional material for that, please let us know, because we will be desperate to bring you back.
Listen, I'm hopping in your DMs. Just be ready. I'm going to be there. I know you be like, this girl crazy, but I'm going to be in there. I'll be like, David, you're my best friend. We are friends. Don't do this to me. You gotta come back.
This is what I can say about this new project that I'm working on is, and I just had to I sent my editor an email last week, and we're a long ways off. This is a 300-page book that we're doing together. But I was like, there's stuff in here, specifically certain words that don't get used, aren't supposed to be used in public anymore, that we absolutely have to use. And because we're dealing, especially with the time period in American history where there was one word in particular that was used to describe us all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I can't not have this word in the book. And my editor was like, nope, you're right. So we're going all the way up the corporate chain to make sure we can use it. And I was like, I'm going to need the people to get behind me, because there's going to be a lot of people who don't understand why this word is in the book, right? And it's like, but you can't have a book that seriously deals with racism and our ideas of race in this country without that particular word. But it's going to be, this is me attacking everything. This is attacking, the failure of Reconstruction. It's the lost cause narrative that has totally driven our historical perspective in this country, right? And people are gonna hate me. And I'm so excited for it. It ain't even.
And people are gonna hate it. Yes, I just came to fight you in the book.
Some men just want to watch the world burn, and I'm here for it. I'm here for it.
Well, thank you so much for being so gracious with so much time. While you did break my heart to hear that Nighthawk will not be returning, I can at least take solace in the fact that something even harder is coming out. So thank you for that. For the uninitiated, I would say Mr. Walker has produced a cornucopia of fantastic stories, whether it's DC Cyborg, whether it's the aforementioned Nighthawk, whether it's what should genuinely be considered a legendary run on Power Man and Iron Fist, and Bitterroot. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Walker, but I believe that the omnibus for Bitterroot is dropping this upcoming February. Is that correct?
That's the plan. There's always the chance that it'll be delayed, but we're working towards it coming out in February. 520 some odd pages with a little bit of new material in it.
All right. Yeah, and the absolute last thing I will say, the best thing I love about what you did is the number of PhDs and journalists that you got to add to the back of the book. I swear it is such a lost and forgotten art for graphic novels in terms of, what happens when the readers finish reading the book and they would like to learn more and figure out where they can get books and find intelligent people. And, I have to give you credit because I have praised you heavily for the Black Panther graphic novel in terms of that was the best appendix for any graphic novel I've ever seen before. And you could read it and see how much work you had done. And it's the same thing for Bitterroot. So I hope you continue to do that. I think especially with this being a goal for you that try to put hope into young people, I think considering how poorly Black history is taught in this country in general, besides the fact that it's not taught at all, but to the degree in which it is taught, it's taught poorly. I think the articles that you included are great signal flares for young people to be able to figure out where to go next. So thank you for that as well.
No, thank you. That's, John Jennings is the one who actually puts all that stuff together. And John is one of my best friends and a great creator. And when we go into volume 4, Bitterroot, that stuff's going to be there too. And so I'll tell you right now, the working title of volume 4 is Bitterroot, Mississippi Burning. And and the plan right now is to have every single essay and article written by scholars that originally are from Mississippi.
Wow.
Oh, that's stellar.
That's gonna be dope.
That's stellar.
So yeah, so we'll see what happens. We're trying to make it happen.
Well, you succeeded in giving us hope today. Now we got all kinds of things to look forward to be hopeful about. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Everybody, thank you for joining us for yet another episode of Pop Culture. This, of course, has been brought to you from the historic Sankofa Bookstore located in Washington, D.C., right across the street from Howard School campus. Speaking of Black knowledge, if you are looking for some, we got Black knowledge available on every single conceivable wall. So, including Bitter Root right over here. So if you came tonight and you didn't get the book, thank you for buying beverages and food. Grab a book on the way out as well. And we'll see you next time. Thank you again so much.
Peace, y'all.
All right.